Friends, here is a truth that we need to face. Anxiety is the leading cause of ill health for Australian women aged 15 to 44. And for those aged 45 to 64, anxiety is still right up there. It ranks fourth and depression is fifth. I think these are alarming statistics. As an ambassador for Beyond Blue, I really am committed to finding new ways to support all of our mental well-beings so that we can all find more joy in our days. We know traditional options like therapy and medication aren't for everyone, and the statistics are really telling us that. So that's why we've invited the fabulous Jessica Maguire to introduce us to the vagus nerve and how regulating our nervous system might help us lead healthier and more balanced lives as we age. Jessica, it is a real pleasure to have you talking to us today. I'm extremely passionate about this subject and really interested in the vagus nerve as a system that perhaps hasn't had as much publicity as it should have so far.
Thanks, Shelley, for having me. And yes, you're right. We haven't heard a lot about the vagus nerve until the last sort of decade, and its really important role in things like anxiety. So I'm really excited to be here and share some of the science with you.
So, look, what is it and where is it in our bodies? Is it one small part, or we're getting to understand that it has a lot of power in our bodies?
Yeah, that's right. It's really like a series of connections. You know, sometimes we think about it as like one nerve we can hack, but it is like a lot of ecosystems. So if you ran your hand down the back of your head and felt the bony skull bit there, and you went inwards, that's where our brainstem is. And the brainstem has a major role in our regulation, if you like, or levels of stress that we experience. And the vagus nerve starts here, and one branch comes down to our heart that we call our ventral branch. But basically, that's the part that's involved in slowing us back down. So it's really important with our ability to cope with and recover from stresses. And this is where we might see things like anxiety show up if it's not functioning well. The other branch or part of it runs from the brainstem all the way down to the lower belly, to our colon, and it touches every organ along the way. So this is involved with our physical health, things like inflammation, which we also know in turn plays a role with our mental health as well now. And then the branch that runs from our heart up to our face, that is part of what we call our social engagement system. And so this is why the people we're around will impact on our nervous system too. So it's relational in that way, which is really fascinating. But it's actually what we call a cranial nerve. And cranial nerves act as a bridge between the body and the brain.
My goodness. So this really is a system, as you say, like a bunch of highways running through our whole body that are all interconnected. How does a physio, which is what you initially started out in as your practice, find their way into being an expert in the vagus nerve?
It's a great question. So about 20 years ago, I was studying a Bachelor of Health Science, and I was looking a lot at ECG leads on people to look at the heart. And so I didn't really know it, but I was actually looking at the health of the vagus nerve, as well as a lot of study I did on the gut. And then I completed a master's of physiotherapy, and I was always really passionate about persistent pain. So that was like after an initial injury, why people kept having this ongoing pain. And the science was really looking at the way that the brain and the body communicated and also changed to create this amplification of pain. And so there was a lot around this to do with how we believe what's going on with our pain will amplify it. So thoughts, stories, beliefs. And so what I was seeing a lot when patients came to see me was a little bit like I was looking above the surface of the water at the tip of an iceberg. So I was seeing things like pain, people presenting with gut problems, insomnia, and things like anxiety. And it normally came in like a cluster of symptoms, you know, they were coming in all together. But I knew under the surface of the water there was more going on, and that's where I really wanted to be able to help make the biggest difference. So my work lent more and more into the way the brain and the body communicated as a network to create the experience of pain. And this is also how we experience emotions. So we don't have one area in the brain, say, for feeling sadness or fear. It's really to do with bodily messages coming up and then different regions of the brain. And how we perceive a threat or not has to do with the vagus nerve. So it was more about getting to know this threat detection system. And then in 2017, I decided, okay, I'm going to close up my physiotherapy clinic and I'm going to go overseas and spend large periods of time really looking at this science, at the cutting edge stuff. And it was at that time that my beautiful brother tragically passed away as well. And so I experienced these ups and downs in my own nervous system at that time. So my learning was really about learning to walk the talk, if you like, and put these into practice because it was a big shock for me. And I think a lot of people that come to nervous system work is because they've had something like a big loss or grief or shock. And so I spent a couple of years really going deep into the science of this. And then when I came back to Australia, I was working a lot with patients who were experiencing these ups and downs and anxiety, and they were sometimes moving into like a shutdown or freeze. And so my passion has always been in empowering people to step back into the driver's seat and do things themselves. So I created a workshop called the Vagus Nerve Workshop, and it just grew so quickly. And then we took it online and it was picked up and shared so quickly. And now we're almost at 20,000 students who've come through our trainings and programs, which is so fantastic. And it's a place where I can see a lot of people are just being able to take control back of their own health, which is really what I'm passionate about.
There's so many wonderful things in there to unpack. And I guess I'll start with a lot of the feelings that we have will start in our gut. And of course, we've heard about there being now two brains, that our gut is a brain, our brain is a brain. You're saying a lot of things, the feelings that you have will be in your stomach, and trusting your gut instinct. But of course, now we know if that's connected to the vagus nerve, that's then transferring up to our brain to then have all those reactions on our other organs, our breathing, our heart rate, digestion, mood. Do you sort of see it that way, that there is these two brains operating, but that is what the vagus nerve is?
Yeah, it's such a fascinating part because what we know is that 80% of the messages that the vagus nerve communicates are running from our body up to our brain. And, we put so much emphasis on if I can just think differently, then I'll feel better. But when we look at what happens in anxiety, there is more of an activation in the lower centers of the brain, which we might call the survival brain. And we tend to not be able to access the thinking brain or the cortex when we're really stressed. So often thinking about things or trying to be more positive or shift our mindset, it's just incomplete for helping us to move towards regulation. But as you said, if we can tap into the messages that are running from our body up to the lower centers in our brain, which is where stress activation is happening, which is how we move between the different states of our nervous system, we can actually play a role in helping bring our stress back to bring ourselves back to a calmer baseline. And so the gut is one of the richest places for messages to come from. I think when people feel really anxious, they might recognize that they might feel sick to their stomach, or they feel, an overwhelming sense of sensations there. But even when we're more calm and regulated, we can actually use the messages from our gut to make wise decisions that are in line with our deepest values. So it's such a rich network to connect with. The challenge is for people who've experienced chronic and traumatic stress, they may actually cut off from sensations in their body because they're overwhelming. And so a lot of the relearning is about how to be present and feel safe again in our bodies so that we can tune into these messages and improve the two-way connection between the brain and the body.
I can see how this takes a practice now. It's not something that we're just going to be able to do in one small session. But we've learned a lot about breathing here on the Aging Project. We do talk about our overall gut health. We've explored meditation, and it seems like all of these things come together to help our vagus nerve. Where should we start with your practice or with discovering our own vagus nerve, Jess? What do you suggest people do, whether they are in a high stress situation at that particular time or whether they're dealing with overall anxiety that seems to be with you from the moment you wake up till the moment you go to sleep? Are there different modalities that we can be using to calm our vagus nerve?
The place that I tell everyone to start with is to know the different states of your nervous system and to really know it in an embodied way. And the reason is some tools that we reach for are fantastic if we're anxious, but those tools may not be so helpful for if we're feeling flat and shut down. So for instance, let's say you're already feeling flat, shut down, disconnected. And let's say you decide, okay, I'm going to try this yin yoga class. And a lot of it is focusing on slowing the breath down even more. Our blood pressure is already low. We're already feeling flat. So that may not be the most useful tool for us in that moment. So it's a little bit like looking at how we apply this as getting the dose right. Because when we look at how the brain and the nervous system change, one of the key principles to that is specificity. So we need what we do to be specific to the state that we're in to create a change in our brain and our body or to bring our vagus nerve online to be working. But if we look at this way that we move between the different states of our nervous system, that's not something we choose consciously. So we want to be able to say, okay, my brain and my body are taking in messages that are outside of awareness and I'm moving into, anxiety, or I might be moving into shutdown without it being my fault. But if we can learn to connect to the messages inside our body, this is called interoception, or our eighth sensory system. We know that it brings our vagus nerve back online. So if we can connect to bodily sensations, these are the foundations for our emotions. Now, whether we tend to cut off from sensations or for people who are anxious, research has shown that there's actually the message of the sensation runs up to the brain from the vagus nerve, and there can be a connection to the fear circuitry in the brain. So it's about learning to recognize bodily sensations in this present moment. And that might also mean that we need to connect to our environment as well. So we can take in what's happening in our environment, particularly when we're really anxious and panicked, as we notice sensations to bring us back into the present moment. Because a lot of the time, particularly people who've experienced traumatic stress, they're responding to the past. They're using coping strategies or not on purpose, but their nervous system is responding through what it was learned. The other thing that's really great, if we want to get better at allowing mobilization to come into our nervous system. So this is a little bit nerdy, but stay with me on this one. If we think about what's happening in the state where anxiety happens, the first thing we'll often feel is this mobilizing energy that tells us to take action, to get up and move towards or move away from something.
So this is our fight or flight.
Exactly. Now, that is actually the same channel that our energy comes from for play, for vitality, for passion. And if we can learn, if we find that anxiety is something that we often experience, if we can learn to let this mobilizing energy in, but we do this by keeping it in check by the vagus nerve, we'll actually move into a blended state of our nervous system that we call play. So there's mobilizing energy, but it's actually contained. And you might think, when I talk about this, I feel this mobilizing energy because I love this topic so much. But it's about keeping regulation there. And so for people who can allow some mobilizing energy in, but stay connected with another person who's in a state of regulation, our nervous system will be kept in check by that. And play is so personal. For some people, it could be going to a comedy night. For some people, it could be singing karaoke. For others, it could be an actual game per se, or walking in nature in a beautiful place or location. But this is what's meaningful for you to create that mobilization, but also keep it in check by the vagus nerve. And if we think of this like going to the gym, over time, we're going to be able to allow more mobilizing energy into our system without moving into fight or flight or anxiety.
Okay, so that has to be a language then that you're telling yourself. And as you say, the vagus, it's all connected. So say it's bungee jumping, for example. That is for most people going to create that enormous fight or flight reaction in them. But for people who've done it 1,000 times over, they will be in that play state. So you're saying your body is reading that in its own way. So if you've got, your instructor there or the person that hooks you up who's expressing fun and joy and excitement in that moment, but you're feeling fear and anxiety and sheer terror, we can change that feeling. And obviously this is on a very basic one instance, one moment level. But if we take on their perception of what that is, our body will react differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So the cues of safety, how we said how we move between the different states. If another person is sending us cues of safety through their voice, through how they listen, through, smiling with their eyes, through their gestures, their energy is calm, our survival brain is taking that in. This doesn't need like a cognitive registering. It goes to that survival brain and says, things are okay. Now, I would definitely be in fight or flight bungee jumping. So there is that part where it's very personal. But this is what's so interesting is that stress and trauma are very subjective. So, what might be stressful for me might not be stressful for you. Like what I experience as something traumatic might not be the case for you. But what we can see is that when we have uncertainty, when it's something that's novel, when we really lose agency or choice, that's where we're more likely to have traumatic stress. But if something is, creating a mobilization in our nervous system, we have the inbuilt capacity to recover from that with the vagus nerve. It's really about bringing us back down to that regulation, and we will recover fully from it if it's kept in check and not something that maybe feels similar to a traumatic thing in our past. But this is, again, it's a very subjective experience. It's not something we can say it is or it isn't stress or trauma.
A quick pause for anyone interested in joining our DNA testing program in partnership with Fit Genes, a world-leading genetics company. So many of you have already joined our Fit Genes community. So now, for anyone who hasn't, it's your turn. Get to know your genes with us. When you know your genes and your unique genetic breaks, you can do something about it. For us here at the Aging Project, we've learned it's the best first step in our aging well journey. If you'd like to learn more, visit theagingproject.com and join the Fit Genes waitlist. We'll send you all the details so you can get started. With anxiety showing up, it can just turn up at any moment, can't it? It doesn't necessarily have to be triggered by something happening to you at that moment. You can just have this feeling of overwhelm at a time. What can we be doing at that moment to regulate our vagus nerve?
So in the moment, one of the best places that if we think of like the brain is a little bit like in the dark, it's like it's in the skull and it doesn't actually know everything that's going on. Although we've come in thinking the brain's where anxiety is happening, there is parts to that, yes. But think about what's happening in your body. There's a huge physiological part of it, and it's the body that we want to connect with. Now, our sensory messaging from our body is actually what is sending messages up to the brain saying, hey, everything's okay down here or not. So one thing that we can do is tap into our body by what is connecting to our environment. So the outside part of the body, like thinking if you're sitting there now where we go, okay, I can feel myself connected to the environment through my feet, through my spine against the back of the chair. And we send those messages to the brain, that survival lower part of the brain. We're actually sending messages that are like, things are okay. There's not anything, that's dangerous. But so often, if we feel like our heart's racing and we focus on that, we're sending a message up to the brain that there's danger. So it's about directing our attention in a way that can help to send a cue that things are fine. And when we do that, that's really what's going to tell the brainstem to turn the vagus nerve on. And it's a little bit like, we explain it as like a brake. If you were riding a bicycle downhill and you didn't want to go too fast, you just keep a brake on with your fingers. Well, when we manage to tap in with our sensory information that's coming on, it's like we're applying the brake with our fingertips to slow back down. And this is why the body is so important. And it's often been, left out of the equation. We've been very brain focused, but the body is so important when it comes to stress, and particularly traumatic stress, and learning to build regulation through the vagus nerve.
Okay, how do we do that, Jess?
So that would be the best place, is to start with connecting to what we feel in terms of like the sensory information that's coming in our environment. So if we were sitting here right now and you were feeling anxiety talking to me, and you were to say, okay, I'm going to rest my spine back in my chair for a moment, and I'm just going to let myself focus on my spine touching the chair. And then most people will be, if they're in fight or flight, there's going to be tension in what we call the proprioceptors. So the shoulders will be lifted up, the jaw will be tight, and there will also usually be some holding in the body. So we want to do the opposite of that. Again, we're letting the brain know everything's okay down here. So if we let the spine rest back against the chair, soften the shoulders, take in as well the parts of the pelvis that are being supported by the chair. And even if we're in conflict with somebody, this can work so well to help bring in regulation, and nobody knows that we're doing this. It's actually quite hard to do some deep breathing exercises if we're having a serious meeting with somebody. But by connecting with the body's sensory system, such as like what we're looking at is proprioceptive input from the joints, we are sending messages up to the brain that there's safety there, and the vagus nerve will come in and it will return us back towards regulation. So that is a simple, easy 1-minute thing that we can do, and that nobody even needs to know we're doing. And if also it goes the other way, so if we tend to dissociate or cut off from our body, if we connect to the signals of the body, it's like we're turning the volume back up on these sensations, and we don't spiral down into disconnection, shame, and hopelessness. So either way, what's happening in the sensations can turn down volume, like the volume on loud sensations like a racing heart or our guts churning or tension in our shoulders. or we can turn up the volume on the sensations that are too quiet if we've cut off from our body as well.
Right. So really narrowing in on that connection between the two, and rather than I'm in a moment, I'm having a moment, rather than I'm okay, which is only telling your brain what's okay. You need to reassure your brain from your body's perspective that everything's okay. So narrow down on the things that are okay, like my feet are solid on the floor, I'm sitting into my pelvis, my back is fine. So sort of reassuring yourselves from a body perspective, telling your brain that everything's all right.
Absolutely. That's such a big part of it. But what my students usually find that just recognizing, this is my nervous system moving into the sympathetic state. That in itself is a reappraisal that makes them feel confident and reassured seeing what's happening rather than feeling out of control. Like, because that's what anxiety feels like, right? We feel like, whoa, I'm being taken over by something out of our body. And this really gives us a framework to say, I've moved up to anxiety. Okay, I see this happening now. And instead of getting caught up in this as our sense of self and who we are, we can go, there's enough space to say, this is my nervous system responding. And for a lot of people, when they start using this, it's like a map that they've found to navigate what's happening. And that gives them confidence and trust, which brings them back towards regulation as well. So, yeah, it's starting with that and working with the body.
It's very interesting, isn't it? There was a fabulous Disney film that came out called Inside Out about 12 years ago, and it had all these little characters that were in this lovely girl's brain, and they were driving, and one would jump in the driver's seat, and then they'd be in control of her life for, a period of the movie. And then Joy was the one that was supposed to be in charge all the time, but she lost a little bit of control, and then anxiety would jump in, and then fear would hop in and drive. And now I do see my body that way, and I often talk on the podcast a bit about it. It's not me, it's my brain, or it's not me, it's my body, or it's not me, it's my system, to sort of compartmentalize myself into different areas and go, okay, well, I need to take control of my brain, therefore I'm going to let my body do the talking. And it seems like that's sort of the vagus system working in my body for itself. Is there a way that the vagus system the vagus nerve is in play all the time, or is it something that does only turn on or turn off in those fight or flight situations? Is it something that we should have activated all the time?
Oh, I love what you said then. That's such a good analogy with the movie. I've heard other students say that, and I think it's a great way to think about what's happening rather than, because we think it's our identity that we're just a weak person or we're not strong enough, and then that creates more stress because we feel bad about ourselves then. So it's such a good analogy.
No, you've just got the wrong driver in the seat.
Exactly. So to answer your question, what happens, this is really amazing. The vagus nerve, the branch that runs from the brainstem down to our heart, that evolved more recently when we look at evolution, so that humans could collaborate and work together. So rather than being, in fight or flight all the time, eat or be eaten, what was recognized, or who survived, I'm not quite sure how that process played out, but the ventral vagal branch emerged so that we could have connection, collaboration in a safe way. Now, the vagus nerve is actually always working. So I used that analogy before where I said it's a bit like the bicycle. So imagine we're on a bike, we're riding downhill, and we're keeping a little bit of the brake engaged with our fingers. So the vagus nerve is actually doing that to us all the time, from our brainstem to our heart. If we didn't have the vagus nerve there doing that, our heart would beat at around 90 beats per minute at rest. But really, we're seeing that beat around about 70 on average. There's a lot of things that depend on that. And this is where what we see is the vagus nerve's function. When we breathe in, the vagus nerve just relaxes that brake a little bit. And when we breathe out, it engages. So our heart actually beats faster when we breathe in, and it slows down when we breathe out. And that variability tells us if the vagus nerve is working well or not. It's so fascinating because that system is so fine-tuned. But when we talk about having this ability to be flexible and adaptable, and like what we said, if we want to stretch our capacity for things, like say the bungee jumping, but maybe for me not that scary, but if we want to be able to step outside of our comfort zone, this is really about fine-tuning that ability to let the brake off or re-engage it depending on what we're facing. And for so many people who experience anxiety, it's about relearning to match what's happening inside our brain and our body to what's happening outside the environment. And that's something we can do because anxiety is usually a learned thing, not consciously. I'm talking in that survival brain. Like in some way, we learned to respond with mobilizing our nervous system. And we can also relearn because of neuroplasticity, where we know our brain and our nervous system can change.
So things like putting our body under controlled stress. Let's take ice baths, for example, which is really hot right now, and I do one every other day, for the idea of I'm physically putting myself in an uncomfortable situation to learn that it's okay and that I'm in control, and that I can get myself out of that situation when it gets too much. Things like deep breathing or mindfulness, again, are taking us consciously to a place of rest and digest, so that hopefully when we are in a situation of stress, we've got the tools to then bring ourselves back down. Is that what these things are good for, and are they working with the vagus nerve at the time?
Yeah, that's another great question, Shelley. I think it's really helpful to have like a daily practice that we use that nourishes our nervous system, and that what we choose will really depend on the state that we find ourselves in or where we tend to sit. So it's almost like a temperature, like a thermostat in a house. And let's say we tend to swing up to anxiety. That's a little bit like the temperature's turned up too high and it's too hot. And so that might mean that we need to look at, okay, what is going to bring the vagal brake in? What is going to slow me back down more so? But somebody who, let's say, tends to dissociate, freeze, they tend to collapse or find themselves in hopelessness, shame, and shutdown, they actually might need something else, which is to bring them back up, more up regulation. Because essentially, burnout means we don't have enough of the heat and our vagus nerve isn't working so well. So for those people, we might want to bring in a little bit more oomph, if that makes sense. So depends on the state that we're in. And then really what we will see the greatest change that will take place is the things that we can do in the heat of the moment. So when we spoke before, when I was saying using that sensory information in the heat of the moment, that's where I really like to spend most of my time, because it's when the going gets tough, that's when we're in the optimal zone for learning. Like that's when our nervous system will learn the most. So daily practices are great, and it's, lots of people find things that are really helpful, but it's when you are on the verge of maybe saying something that you will later regret. It's when you feel yourself about to spiral down because you feel like no matter what you do, it's not enough. That is when your nervous system will learn the most. And this is why I love using that sensory work to say, when your body feels like it will literally drop and collapse into shame, we can bring it up and say, let's have a corrective experience. So maybe in your past, you collapsed under like stressful times that felt similar to this, but you can have a corrective experience. And it really plays out in relationships, like say someone's dating and they might find, well, I haven't heard back from somebody, and they start to get anxious. This is where we might lean into the tools that allow us to regulate ourselves in that moment so that we can sit in that feeling of, I am feeling anxious right now, but that doesn't mean I'm going to be rejected. That doesn't mean that this person is going to leave me. And that's where we really change the narrative, it's where we really change the story, because what we find is that these stories come up depending on what state of our nervous system we find ourselves in. So I say do both. Have your daily practice, but train your nervous system in the moments where you are feeling anxious or scared to learn to come back to regulation. So you attune to your body in the present moment, and learn to meet that where it's at as well. So that's where I see the biggest transformation happens for people.
And obviously the biggest growth in your sector as well, because I haven't seen a practitioner with, vagus nerve expert. I can't go and see a vagus nerve expert like I do a dentist, or can you?
Look, it is coming into a lot more, like the awareness of the nervous system is coming out a lot more. Like we have such an enthusiastic bunch of health and wellness practitioners that join our programs, which is fantastic. But, there are resources the modalities that can help. Like we know that massage can play a role in helping us bring in more of the vagus nerve. And there are things like you've mentioned already with our gut health as well, if that's something. So I see this as very integrative, or like we can look at improving the health of our vagus nerve with a lot of lifestyle factors too, like exercise, sleep, and as you said, nutrition would be the three biggest ones. But for people more so, I think it's helpful to look at if the symptoms are there, like we have persistent pain, we have anxiety, we have insomnia, we've got like also gut things going on. It's really about, well, what can I look at together to support me with that? But there is a lot of this that people can do on their own when they understand their nervous system too, which is so amazing, because I think that's why I love this work, to empower people to say, yes, I may need health and wellness practitioners, and that's great, but I can also play a part in this myself through what I do daily and in the face of stresses.
So you mentioned the gut health, and obviously that is connected, but does this come down to diet as well? Can our diet be giving us anxiety?
I would say the research now is quite strong around inflammation and depression. Like we're definitely seeing that. But there is some really good research that's come from the Mood and Food Centre around how nutrition is impacting on our mood and our states as well. The vagus nerve will be communicating signals from our gut microbiome up to the brain. And we're also seeing now with irritable bowel syndrome, it's so funny, isn't it? Because it's like before seeing the vagus nerve, so many people go, yeah, I know stress makes my gut worse. But then once you see that picture of the vagus nerve, it's like a light bulb moment for people of like, oh, they're so connected. There's like a real visual connection there. And it's very fast too. So people with anxiety are more likely to have IBS. And people with IBS are more likely to have anxiety. So it goes both ways in that direction. And probably what's interesting is irritable bowel syndrome has been classified now as a disorder of gut-brain connection. It's not necessarily like whilst food can play a very important role, it's also how those signals are being relayed via the vagus nerve and how they're being processed in the brain as well. So I think that's a really interesting time we've come into. But nutrition will certainly play a role indirectly as well, because, think about when you feel hangry. There's low blood glucose levels. It influences, like for me, my window of tolerance or the ability I have to tolerate emotions when I'm hungry. I'm still breastfeeding, so, I'm hungry all the time.
Oh, congratulations. Yes, and yes, you will be. Back in season 1, episode 12, we learned about the benefits of collagen from the amazing Dr. Frank Lipman. It was that conversation that saw us researching the best possible collagen products we could find for us and for you. I'm excited to say our favourite brands now available inside our sister platform and store, youmusttryit.com. You'll also find a range of fabulous products from gynecologist Dr. Anna Kebeka, who we interviewed in season 2. I absolutely love her maca powder and keto green protein power. After today's episode, perhaps go back and listen to episode 2. It's called Let's Take a Menu Pause with Dr. Anna Kebeka. It's worth a listen. Okay, my friends, now back to today's episode. Jess, can you give us an example of perhaps someone that you have worked with that was in this state of anxiety and came to you for help, around this age, whether it's perimenopause, menopause, whether it's our change of life, there's going to be a lot of that overwhelm happening. Have you got a story you can share with us?
Yes, I've got a few that I can think of, but one that particularly stands out to me is somebody I was working with who, it was in Australia before COVID when the bushfires hit, and that had been quite stressful for her and her family. So there was like that mobilizing energy that came in, and then before she got the chance to recover, then COVID came in. So she was up in mobilization for an extended period of time. Plus, there was going through menopause as well, which we know we see changes to both the brain and the body in this time as well, which can put a lot of women into that mobilizing energy as well. So she wasn't sleeping. And then there was a relational difficulty that came after that as well. So we often think stress that will impact us is like a one-time stress or one big thing. But in her instance, it was a combination of things, the fires, COVID, menopause, the insomnia was making things worse. And what that all led to is what we might call low vagal tone, where we say that the break of the vagus nerve slowing us down, it's almost like it's come off a little bit and it's not engaging again to slow us down. So for her, things that didn't lead to stress before started to lead to prolonged anxiety. And a big part of our work together was starting to help her feel safe. She was having gut issues, but she was also noticing this a lot in her voice. And we know that the vagus nerve plays a role through our communication and speech as well. So that's where I could really hear that coming in for her. But it was starting slowly, connecting to her body. And over 6 weeks, her vagal tone returned back to a healthy range, but it was taking that daily consistent practice for her as well. So although in times of stress where it's repeated, if we don't get a chance to recover, we can get a loss of the vagus nerve working well, but we can also deliberately help it to work well again. So there is that empowered sense of we can play an active role in that too.
I'm sure a lot of our listeners perhaps have been to their GP or a practitioner and said, well, here's some medication for you for your anxiety and your stress. If you're in that situation and would like to explore perhaps this more holistic version, what's your advice there for changing the program?
I think what's wonderful about this work is that you can do it alongside whatever it is that you're doing. So there may be times if we are reconnecting with our body, particularly if we have been overwhelmed by our bodily sensations where we've tuned them out, that as we start to reconnect, we might feel a little bit overwhelmed, and having that support from somebody else is great, But if we look at this in the sense of co-regulation, so co-regulation is where one grounded person can help another person move their nervous system back towards feeling calm. So, you see those people and they smile with their eyes when you're talking to them, and you just feel warmth and connection, and that helps you feel a sense of safety and trust. We can have this with other people. It can come from health professionals, but the beauty of it is it can come from family and friends who are calm, and we can offer this to other people too. But if we find when we're connecting with our body, it is a lot for us and we're really challenged in feeling safe, we may need to lean into other people to help us bring in extra resources, if you like, to help us come back to regulation. And as I said, that may be a health professional, but it also may be somebody that we find extremely supportive and we have a deep sense of trust with too.
There was a beautiful example of this recently. It was actually on the ABC, and one of their presenters had an anxiety attack on air. And he was confident enough to say, this is what's happening. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed. I'm going to step out. And it was beautiful the way that his co-presenters stayed very calm, completely unflustered in the situation, and took control of what needed to be done to give him the space to regulate. And just seeing that play out in real time in a live television situation, particularly coming from the background that I have, was extraordinary. And it seemed to me, yes, his co-workers were well versed in his situation, and they had obviously been trained in how to stay calm and to offer him that security. And it was wonderful to actually see that happening. A lot of the times they would have just cut to something else, and it wouldn't have been explained. And I thought that was, obviously a wonderful coming of age for the world as we know it, that we're becoming more accepting of all of these situations, and we're obviously getting better at dealing with them as well.
I totally agree. And I think for a lot of people who are experiencing panic, somebody being there with, a sense of regulation, and we put so much emphasis on saying the right thing. It's just a presence of a nervous system that's calm and like, I've got you, I've got this, and attuning to us. Like, we often think that it's our nervous system on our own. But if you look at this in the science, our nervous systems are being impacted before we're born by our mother. Once we're born, the relationship and the connection that we have with our parents or caregivers is literally what myelinates or lays down the coating on the vagus nerve to do with how we will access self-regulation and how we'll attach with other people in the future. So, although we may see somebody who has great self-regulation, that's only because they've had healthy co-regulation as that foundation. And I think if we are looking at health, we talk a lot about the biology, we talk a lot about the psychology, but the social is one part that we often forget about. And it is, health is a biopsychosocial thing. It needs all three factors to be healthy or connected, or there's an interplay there. And I love that this is now becoming less taboo, where, people saying, oh, I've experienced panic or I have anxiety, and people don't brush it under the carpet or run away or try and hide it. I think that's a wonderful place that we're coming into.
Jess, I think there's a lot of our community listening that are going to be having light bulb moments right now and literally piecing everything back together and wanting to deep dive on this subject. Of course, they can get hold of you at your website, which is jessicamaguire.com. You have a fabulous Instagram account, Repairing the Nervous System, and of course, a new book that has just come out. If people really want to get into the down and dirty of this, that is a wonderful place to start. How long have you been writing this for, and how did it come about, and where can we get a copy?
Oh, I think it took a publishing house first reached out and said, would you like to write a book? And of course, my own nervous system went, I can't write a book. How could I do this? That was about 2 years ago. But then after allowing myself to grow and learn and stretch, I spent 2 years piecing it together, but it is called The Nervous System Reset. And it's a really good introduction to the nervous system. and it's available at all leading bookstores. But if you want a deep dive, then you go to my website for our more in-depth trainings there as well.
And you said there was programs there, obviously for practitioners to learn, but can individuals do it? As you said, this is really about, again, and we're very encouraging of this here at the Aging Project, is taking control of our own health, so that we can, relieve the pressure on the system as well, but also know what's going on in our own bodies. So is there a program there for individuals to do, or is it just for practitioners?
Oh, I love that, Shelley. That resonates so deeply. Yes, so we have a 3-hour vagus nerve masterclass, and that teaches you all the states. It's equipping you with tools for each state. It's really like, here you go, you've got everything you need to take care of your nervous system. For those who are looking for more of a deeper transformative program, it's really been helpful for people who maybe have had chronic conditions for a long time, then our 8-week vagus nerve program is a great resource. And yes, the nervous system certification course is for health and wellness practitioners to learn more too.
Great. So there is something there for everyone, no matter what stage you're at, whether you're just learning about the vagus nerve or whether you are ready to help others, they can do a program with you. Jess, it's been wonderful chatting to you. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Shelley. I loved it. Thanks so much for having me.
For me, today's conversation feels really important, and my hope is that you can help us share it far and wide. Jessica shared an example of a woman who had multiple things occurring in her life that impacted on her nervous system. I'm sure most of us can relate to that. It's never one thing. Friends, we are in an epidemic of anxiety, and it's obvious to me that we need help, we need more tools and strategies. Medication and talk therapy alone isn't the answer. The good news is, by understanding our nervous system and the importance of our vagus nerve, there is plenty that we can do. So here's a few reminders of what we covered today. Tune in to your nervous system and understand the importance of keeping it regulated. Like any system to work well, it needs support to stay in balance. It doesn't just happen. Let's acknowledge how interconnected our brains and our bodies are, and that's thanks in part to the vagus nerve. Perhaps choosing one moment in your day where your nervous system might become dysregulated. Dinner time, getting a car park, dealing with teenage children. Let's choose to do something differently. What can bring you back into balance? If our responses are learned, then we need to teach our survival brain a new way. This work isn't a quick fix, but I sense in the long term, it's exactly what we need to reduce the statistics around anxiety for us and for future generations. Let's support our nervous systems to stay regulated and in balance. This is so important for aging well. Until next time, I'm Shelley Craft. Thank you so much for joining us here at the Aging Project podcast. Take care of yourselves. I'll speak to you soon. A final thing before I go. If you enjoyed today's episode, can I ask 2 small things of you? Can I ask you to share it with someone you love? We would be so grateful for your support and help to spread the aging well message far and wide. We want everyone aging well alongside us. And if you wouldn't mind subscribing to the podcast, it helps more than you know and means you'll never miss an episode. Thank you so much. Until next time, I'm Shelley Craft, and this, my friends, has been another episode of The Aging Project. As always, the Aging Project podcast is for educational and entertainment purposes. Always seek medical advice from a qualified practitioner.